notice for supporters of Always Take Notes. We are overhauling our offering on the crowdfunding site Patreon.
Our central offer for those who support the show is a sheaf of successful journalistic pitches, which we've solicited from friends of Always Take Notes. Now greatly expanded, the package runs to more than 100 pages.
For those who may not know, a pitch is the document, generally sent by email, that lays out the idea for an article. And we've assembled a huge collection of battle-tested examples that all worked in the real world. Every one of them led to an article getting commissioned.
In the package, we now have successful pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Financial Times, The Economist, The London Review of Books, Vanity Fair, Outside Magazine, The Spectator, The Sunday Times, Esquire, Granta, The Literary Review, Bloomberg Businessweek, and GQ.
Anyone who supports the show with $5 a month or more will receive the full compendium.
For those who contribute $10 per month, we'll also add a signed copy of our new podcast book, which is filled with more real-world advice from past guests on Always Take Notes.
Those who pay $15 a month can join a monthly call with Simon and myself to discuss any aspect of their writing lives.
We're keen for the pitch compendium to be a living and constantly growing document, so if any listeners have successful pitches of their own they'd like to include, do get in touch with us through the podcast website. In every case, we redact the editor's name and email address, so no one is breaking confidences by contributing. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the journalist and author Hannah Barnes.
We spoke to Hannah about Time to Think, her book investigating the Tavistock's gender service for children, her background as an investigative journalist at the BBC, and her current role with the New Statesman.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Hi Hannah, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's excellent to have you on the show. Could we start with the Gender Identity Development Service for Children? When did you come across it and when did your interest kind of start to develop?
Thank you for having me on the show. I first came across it probably in 2017 by chance. I was on maternity leave with my first child, so I had a bit of time. And I read a piece in The Times written by Janice Turner and didn't overly think it, but it was just really interesting. And what she was saying in this piece was that there'd been a rapid increase in the proportion of girls that were being referred to the service who were feeling distressed about their gender and they didn't feel it matched their biological sex. And she also spoke to two clinicians who worked at the service who were becoming increasingly worried as well by what they were seeing. And the piece that was kind of half of it, and the other half was speaking to a young trans man about his transition and how he'd become really influential on YouTube. And Janice kind of tied up those two things, that many of the girls who were sitting in the waiting room at GIDS would often talk about their favourite YouTuber and how seeing someone else who'd gone through that journey helped them think, oh, actually that explains the way I'm feeling. So that's when I first came across it. And then also that same year, 2017, there was a documentary on BBC Two about what was going on in Canada. And this was about a children's gender clinic out there, which had become increasingly in the headlines. And trans activists had actually tried to get it shut down, get the guy who ran it for many years, a psychiatrist called Dr. Ken Zucker. They wanted him out. They accused him of conversion therapy, of trying to prevent young trans people becoming trans and making them stay what some people might call cisgender. In fact, he wasn't doing that. He just wasn't saying that everybody who felt distress about their gender would grow up to be trans. And really just what fascinated me about the documentary was that he had lots of families talking about the experience with their children. And while the stories were very similar and the feelings were very similar, the outcomes were very different. So you had some that continued to identify that way and would have, first of all, drugs to block puberty and then hormones to try and either masculinize or feminize the body, depending how they felt. And then in some cases, surgery. And in other cases, despite the intensity of the distress and the feeling being the same at the start, they overcame it without any of those things. It started with that, and then it sort of grew as time went on.
And then how did you start kind of investigating and getting into the subject while you were at Newsnight?
That was because, we would fast forward about a year or so, and in the autumn of 2018, I was back at work, and it became apparent that all was not well at the Gender Identity Development Service, and that an internal report had been submitted to the board of the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust by a gentleman called Dr. David Bell. Now, he didn't work at the gender clinic, he worked in the wider trust, but at the time he was kind of the governor in charge of staff relations. And what had happened is that 10 members of staff from the clinic had gone to him and said, we're really worried. He told the board this, and they had then asked the medical director to go and look at these concerns after a bit of time. I honestly just thought it was as simple as this. What is going on? Because although when they do make the headlines, NHS whistleblower stories are big and we read about them, they're really not that common. And to get 10 whistleblowers, in inverted commas, at one really quite small service, I just thought was quite extraordinary. I had no preconceived views either about the treatment or whether what they were saying was true, but I felt that there really wasn't much attention going on what actually was happening in terms of care at the clinic. And that's where it started. And then we felt the best way into it to start with was to look at the evidence base, which is what you might do with any health story, really. So my colleague Deborah Cohen, who is a qualified doctor and her background is solely in health journalism, we worked together and we were given some documentation about a study that GIDS had started along with colleagues at University College London hospitals about the impact of blocking puberty on younger children. But at that point, they hadn't actually published it. So whilst they were handing out this medication relatively freely at that time, we didn't really have any data to suggest whether it was beneficial or safe. And events have subsequently shown that that was quite an extraordinary thing to do. But that's where we started.
Given it's such an emotional topic on both sides, how did you approach those initial investigations? You said you went into it with no preconceived ideas. Was it really going in with that evidence-based, objective approach that you felt was a way of navigating between those two poles?
Yeah, it absolutely was. And my background was kind of I hate sort of investigative journalism because I think all journalism should be investigative to some extent, but more kind of long form analytical journalism. So that was always what I'd done with any story. Same with Deb. It was to take the emotion out of it because up to that point, that had been what was lacking. And I think maybe that's why other people who'd reported on the story hadn't cut through in the same way we managed to do eventually. But I have to say I was quite naive. I just thought, well, it can't be that contentious to simply ask the question of what's the evidence base. And I was massively wrong. And obviously, the more we reported and then similarly like the level of detail and the depth that I went into with the book, it's, obviously it is controversial, but I hadn't really anticipated the response, to be honest.
And within the BBC, what was the response when you started getting into this? We saw that you've said that they buried stories, that there was a reluctance to cross-promote segments, stuff like that. I mean, what was going on that side?
To be fair, nothing was ever buried in that, people know those stories exist because they were broadcast. So we had support, enormous support from our editor at the time, Esme Wren, and then when I continued the story on my own, following those initial films, my editor then, Stuart McLean, was also hugely supportive. So Newsnight was brilliant. What did happen, though, is you're right, that usually at the BBC, there's huge effort put into promoting its biggest stories. If there's a panorama, you'll get that story on the radio news bulletins from 6 a.m. There'll be a big online piece on the front page of the news website. The reporter or the producer might appear across programmes throughout the day, etc., etc. And you might have a shorter piece to run on television. And with those early films that formed the investigation, I suppose, that just didn't happen. And there were instances where we had been asked to, for example, write a short bulletins piece, to make what we'd call a cut down, like a shorter version of the TV thing so it could run on the news channel. And we delivered all those things and then they didn't run. So it was more subtle than blocking because they did go out. The Newsnight versions went out, and online pieces were written because largely Deb and I insisted they were, because to create a long-lasting record. But sometimes that they just weren't promoted in the same way that you'd expect, or that I have experienced in other big stories that I did at the BBC during the 15 years I was there.
And what was the decision to turn it into a book like? And at what point in your investigations did you think it had the potential to be in book form?
I think I got to the point in about sometime in the autumn of 2020, actually maybe in the summer of 2020. And I had spoken to so many people at that point, and I had a fair amount of documentation, but there was just so much that we could never get on air, and absolutely not for reasons of being blocked, actually, just because, Newsnight, the structure of it is you do 3 or 4 stories, well, the old structure before it's changed, but the structure of it then was, we'd do 3 or 4 stories per evening in a decent amount of the depth. And with this, it was kind of, so to justify doing it several times, we could obviously do that because there was something new to say each time, but just to do more but greater depth and expand it, it wasn't really possible. And I got to the point where I felt there was so much more that I knew that I hadn't been able to put out, and more stuff was coming all the time, and I couldn't really live with it. Some of it was really awful, and I couldn't sleep sometimes, and I just felt that it had to be known, because I think at that point there was no inkling that GIDS would be closed by NHS England. We really didn't. It wasn't at all clear how things would unfold, and I felt that the only chance of getting things to change and providing better care for this group of obviously vulnerable children was to put all of that in the public domain, so that those with the power to change things could, or could at least know it, and that's why I wanted to do it. And then I had no idea how difficult the process would be, but that's where it came from, really.
I mean, just kind of moving on from that, we saw, it's a substantial book proposal, 17,000 words, shopped to 22 publishers, and then rejections left, right, and centre. Tell us about that, that process.
Well, I didn't actually know how bad it had been at the time. I have a wonderful agent, Toby Mundy, who kind of sheltered me from it. I knew that there'd been rejections and that some people had just ignored him, which I think was the interesting thing. That I think about 50%, just didn't respond at all, which is quite weird. I think when it was happening, I felt completely demoralised, but also just quite angry, because some of the responses of those that did respond were so... Well, they were just cowardly. And I would feel embarrassed to put some of what was committed to paper actually on paper. We had responses saying, "This is so important that you tell this story. It's going to be great." And then unsaid in parentheses, "but not with us." Now, at that point, I would argue you're complicit. You're basically saying, this is a really important story that needs to be told. They knew that I was going to tell it calmly and compassionately and based on evidence. It wasn't a polemic. And they knew that children were potentially being harmed, but they weren't prepared to publish it because some of their junior staff might not be happy, or they had trans writers on their books, or what have you, or they were scared. And I had no respect for that. I think I've hardened in the last few years, but I do think that that's quite disgusting.
It did find a home with Swift Press.
It did.
How did the book kind of take shape and develop from that point?
Well, I met, we were still kind of in lockdown. It was 2021. And I met with Deanna and Mark at Swift on Zoom. I wasn't hiding it, but they didn't know that I was actually 8.5 months pregnant at the time, as my belly was under the desk. But they just got it immediately. They got the story. They'd followed it to some extent in the news, and they said yes, which was fantastic. And then the task came to actually write the thing. And I couldn't have been more wrong in that I thought that I thought a lot of the research had been done, but I was so wrong. And so I gave birth like 2 weeks later after signing the contract, and then had, 11 and a half months to deliver this manuscript. So that was a really stupid thing to do. Don't do that, anybody. Top tip, don't write a book on maternity leave. I mean, I just ended up speaking to people that I didn't even know existed. I spoke to so many people, clinicians, young people who'd been through the service. And so for the first, until Christmas 2021, so we'd signed the contract in May, until Christmas, I didn't write a word. It was purely interviews, research, going through every single document that I could find. I mean, I went through every Freedom of Information request that had been published in ever that dealt with the Gender Identity Development Service, every single set of board minutes for the last decade. I don't know how many, close to 200 hours of interviews, 70 to 80 interviews, and only with people that had direct experience with the service. And it just blew my mind. And at some point you have to stop. And I found that really difficult because there were always more people to talk to. But I thought, if I don't start writing this thing, I'm actually... And then it became very, very intense. So from the January... So my daughter was about 7 months and I had an older child as well. And so I set myself really strict word counts for how much I had to achieve by each week, each month. And then, standard, it was, an 80,000 word book. But when I hit my 80,000 words, I thought, oh shit, I'm nowhere near the end of this story. I'm about maybe half, a bit over half. And then, and I don't know, I can't really work out how I got it all done because I did submit it on time, minus the conclusion. And it was much longer than anticipated. So we got it down a bit, but it was just such a new experience for me, though, because in being in broadcast, you're never completely on your own in broadcast journalism. Even in radio, you often, you might, if you're reporting, you might have a producer, and even if you're doing it all yourself, someone will have a listen and help you edit and stuff like that. But I found it very, very lonely. It was so intense. The material was so upsetting. And just having a deadline so far in advance, and I didn't know at all how the publishing industry worked. And I remember talking to Mark Richards at Swift saying, so what do you want? Should I send you each chapter? He's like, nah, just send me the manuscript. And I'm like, okay. So it was, an experience.
What do you think your experience having interacted with, traditional media organizations and then big publishers during the sales process and then an independent, what does it say about the kind of appetites or restrictions of those different bodies, do you think?
Well, I think, one of the reasons I always dreamt of working for the BBC is because I think it's the best in the world. And I always felt that its job was to pursue the most important and the most courageous stories that others couldn't. Because while, of course, you can argue over the level of the licence fee and what have you, the BBC still is, in a unique position in that it is not beholden to shareholders, it has a guaranteed income stream, and it doesn't have to be, in terms of all its output, commercially viable. So I think it should be the home of the bravest journalism. Whether it always does that is, open to debate. And the publishing industry, in my view, should be the place where, books should prompt national discussion, international discussion even. They should put forward new ideas, encourage you to think differently about things you didn't know about before. And so in my mind, the response of the largest publishers, because of course any agent would take their client to the largest publishers first, to not want to go anywhere near what I think now is largely acknowledged to be one of the most shameful episodes in NHS history in the last generation, is completely damning indictment of the publishing industry. I think, it's not the media's job and it's not publishing's job to take a side on some of the biggest issues of our times. It's to help gain understanding. And I think it's not in a good state. I mean, I thought the media hadn't covered itself in glory on this story, to be frank, as a whole. Obviously, there were exceptions there. But it did a damn sight better than the publishing industry. Like, wow.
You've said as well that obviously the book, like the rest of your reporting, you tried to be fair-minded. It sounded like it was quite hard to write. Is that because of the wealth of material? Is that because of trying to balance the two sides of the debate on the page? What was it that kind of made your manuscript run twice the length that you originally intended?
It was partly because I had so much material, definitely. It was partly, I think it was quite a unique process in that the story wasn't finished. So it was evolving the whole time I was writing, and new things were happening, big things as well. So, for example, so the interim Cass review, for example, came out in March 2022. So that was completely new. And then, I wanted to do that, and it was really important. The decision to close GIDS came after I'd submitted the entire manuscript. So obviously that changed things. And then when I updated it for the paperback, we still didn't have the Cass review, the final version, and, the clinic was closing and stuff. So it was always changing. And so that was difficult because it was an ongoing piece of journalism as opposed to writing about an historic event which had an end. So that was difficult. It was the weight of the material, but there were also it wasn't so much, I don't think the story actually is on the one hand this, on the one hand that. I think there is enough now that something clearly went wrong. Otherwise the service wouldn't have been closed and it wouldn't be so controversial, and the NHS wouldn't have banned the medication that was the only treatment pathway, as in puberty blockers, subsequently. So I don't think it's, on the one hand, it was really good, on the one hand, it was really bad. Something clearly went wrong. That's a fact. Understanding why and how you prevent it happening again is the story, I think. And that, there were mitigating factors, obviously, but I don't think it's possible to make the argument that this was a great service providing fantastic care for each and every child that went through it, because it simply wasn't. And then there were also, I don't know if they're moral dilemmas or ethical dilemmas that came up. I was privy to a lot more information than I put in the book. I mean, that would be the case with anything that you do, any story. But it was what to include. And, I was very mindful that, people might disagree with this, but I was very mindful that at the heart of it was our children and young people. So you have to write with compassion. But I'm also mindful that the people working in the clinic were just doing their job, actually. And at certain periods of time, they can't really be blamed for the mistakes that were made, because the evidence base wasn't there. And that gets harder to justify over time. But so I made a decision, for example, that I wouldn't name anybody. I wouldn't name, just your standard clinician in the service unless they wanted to be named. I named the leadership because that's fair game. They made the decisions and that was their job. But I didn't name other people. Some people told me things that I felt that if I put in might undermine them in some ways, and that, that I don't know, or that would make them vulnerable. Not undermine them, not undermine their credibility, but that was too personal about them. Things like that. And certainly with some of the young people, I was very keen not to pass judgment on what I thought, because so the chapters, the case studies, if you like, the chapters which are all about different people who've gone through the service, I've written it in a way that as much as possible, it's verbatim, it's their words. I don't pass judgment on whether, it's not for me to say, oh, are they happy really? Or, because I don't think I could possibly do that. And I think some of them, well, all of them actually, they gave me a huge amount of time and they shared details with me that were so intimate and sensitive, that the ones that were living their lives as trans adults, they gave me their birth names and they showed me documentation about, and that's a really big deal. And for me to even attempt to question or undermine their narrative in any way was a no-no.
This is much more of a kind of technical writing question, but when you had this manuscript that was 160,000 initially, how did the editing process work and how much of the cutting was you and how much was done on the publisher's side?
Well, it did end up being so it ended up being about 135, I think, 135,000. It was it was a collaborative process. What we felt was that it wasn't like that chunk needs to come out. It just needed to, it needed pruning. So there were certain, I think maybe a couple of chapters were combined into one or something like that. But the case studies all stayed, and I felt very strongly about that. I mean, in a way, it's sort of two books into one, because I think if you had I can't remember off the top of my head, but the case studies alone, if you took them out, I think it's about 40,000 words. Now, that would then get you down to normal book length, but they're vital. I mean, not that was a suggestion that, you took all the things out, but really it was a fair bit of self-editing. I mean, Mark was great in saying, this doesn't work, and when we moved things around as well, which meant that you could stop duplication and things. But it was pruning really, it was salami slicing as opposed to, chopping, if that makes sense.
It does. And another reporting kind of technical question. In terms of those case studies, how did you find the subjects to start with? And how did you kind of go about earning their trust and convincing them is maybe not the right word, but encouraging them to open up to you?
There were different ways. So one, I had already spoken to us at Newsnight, and we hadn't massively kept in touch, but we were on good terms and what have you. So I went back to her. I had spoken to other young people during the Newsnight things and parents, and I posted on the Reddit trans and detrans forums, which didn't go terribly well as it happens. But and interestingly, one of the case studies, who is a young trans man, he was like, do you know what? I want to speak to you because everyone's slacking you off on Reddit. And so I just wanted to see what it was like and make up my own mind. But I think so it was a variety of things, and other people who'd worked in, other journalists and things like that. So a variety of ways. I think you build people's trust. I don't think there's any secret to it in a way. It's just being honest. So, for example, Hannah, who's in the book, who we'd spoken to at Newsnight in our first film, actually, in 2019. So she's massively in favour of Jid, says she had a great time, felt really supported, all these things, very positive. And way back when I first spoke with her in 2019, we were very honest about the film we were making. We said, look, the film is going to be quite, it's going to be honest about what we don't know about the evidence base. And yet, you've been on Blockers and you've documented this on YouTube, but people are quite concerned. So I think it's about allowing those people to make informed consent about whether they want to speak to you or not. You never record the interview straight away. You have various chats and there were various chats that would form. There wasn't just one interview with any of them. It was several hours. But I think being totally honest about what you're doing, and that you will say things that they probably won't like, and you'll say things that they will like, and open-minded. And I think that's it. But also because there'd been this previous work, and I was open about all of that, and they just felt that I would be fair, even if they, you don't have to agree with everything someone says, but to be treated well and think that you've been fairly portrayed.
And what was the response when it came out, both in terms of how the book was received on review pages? We saw its kind of fairness was referred to a lot, but also, more generally in the debate. GIDS had closed in 2022, but that was before the book came out. But you said that MPs had...
Oh, no, it didn't. GIDS didn't close till 2024.
Oh, okay, right. Sorry about that. But you'd said that MPs had been in touch with you and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have hoped for a better response to the book, really. I mean, to get favourable reviews from the Morning Star to the Telegraph was pretty good, and everything in between. And I think that spoke to the fact that this really isn't a left or right wing issue or a culture war issue. Well, certainly not the way I wrote it. It was a healthcare story, and arguably a healthcare scandal, really. So I was delighted with the reaction to the book, and then it was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize and the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction. It was a Sunday Times bestseller. So in terms of all that, I was absolutely delighted. I do think it there were other things as well, but I do think it played a major role in shifting the debate globally. I mean, for example, NPR in the US had never had any kind of, I'm told anyway by friends in the United States, that had never entertained a kind of questioning of the affirmative model at all. And yet I did like an hour live on NPR, which was great. Similarly, in Australia, the ABC had never allowed that kind of questioning of the affirmative approach, and I was on the ABC. And I think it allowed people, because it was received so well, and so many doctors spoke well about it, and it allowed people to have that calmer debate. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to write it as well, that to sort of bring it out into the wider public and allow people to go, oh, hang on, what's been going on here? So I do... and yeah, you're right, with members of Parliament. I mean, Wes Streeting, the current Health Secretary, has been very kind and has name-checked me in Parliament twice, actually, to thank me for the work. But obviously that work's only possible because people are willing to talk to you. But I think it did shift the dial. I think particularly those on the left of politics, it shifted something, saying, look, it isn't kind, which is the way it been portrayed by some. It's not kind to lie to young people in distress and promise them that all their problems will go away by a medicine that actually we have no idea whether that's the case, and in some cases it would seem it's actually harmful. So I think it did really make quite a big impact.
As long-time listeners of the show will know, we published Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, in 2023. We're pleased to say that we have now put together a new and updated edition of the book, which now features contributions from more than 100 past guests on the podcast.
The book, which is available now, is the distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 7 years. It offers frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Alongside all the great guests we quoted in the first edition, the update includes new material from Harlan Coben, Victoria Hislop, Lee Child, Megan Nolan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Philippa Gregory, Joe Nesbo, Paul Theroux, Hisham Matar, and Bettany Hughes.
Published by Ithaca Press, the latest edition of Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, is available from all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it. Could we roll back now to your early life? Did you have an interest in writing from an early age?
No, in a word. No, I'm not one of these people that I always dreamed of being a journalist or a writer. Not at all. For a while, as a teenager, I wanted to be a lawyer, and then I went to university and had not really any idea what I wanted to do. I didn't write for a student paper. I flirted with management consultancy and banking, as people who do my degree tend to. And and then it was only really when I graduated, I realised I didn't want to do that I sort of thought about journalism. So, yeah, it's not a very exciting story.
And then you did a master's in broadcast. What took you in that direction?
Broadcast over print, or just
doing a journalism course?
So after graduating, I sort of worked like for free for a local paper, and then I did hospital radio, which is fantastic. Anyone should do it, actually. It's very sad, but it's fun. And was trying to do that, and I always preferred broadcasting to print anyway. But and then I worked for a year for a political news agency, I suppose is the way to describe it. And I think it was during that year that I felt this was interesting, but it wasn't really kind of what I wanted to do. It was very wonky, and I wanted to, be in news and do that side. So at that point in time, which was about 2004 or 5, it was very much the thing. So I was told if you wanted any chance of getting into the BBC, you had to have a journalism qualification at that point, because it was after David Kelly, the government scientist, had taken his own life, and there was this big scandal, I don't know if you remember it, where Andrew Gilligan, a BBC journalist at the time, had gone on to the Today programme live and broken this news that the government had sexed up its dossier on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and it unravelled, and so the BBC had this big soul-searching exercise at the time, to put it mildly, saying that actually live two-ways were never to be the conduit for breaking very controversial news. And then out of that came, look, people need the proper journalism basics, including shorthand, actually. And so that's why I did the postgrad, not at City in broadcast. And then we all had a very rude awakening that you couldn't just walk into a job at the BBC. So I worked for a couple of years after that in commercial radio, and then managed to get in.
How is writing for radio different to writing for print, or indeed for television?
Well, writing for broadcast, so both media, is different to print because you've only really got one hit at it. So if you think about the way anybody consumes your product, if you like. So if you're listening to the radio, you've probably got it on in the background, or you might have it as a podcast now, but you're just listening and it's transient, it's gone. So it needs to be clear. You can't have really long sentences with 8 commas in them, because you're just going to completely lose the person. You're thinking about texture, what's nice to listen to. So it is really important to have a mix of voices, really important to have men and women. Like if you've got 3 middle-aged men, all with southern accents, called John, James and Gerald, it's almost impossible for the listener to have any idea who is talking at anyone. So there's all these other aspects which they don't exist in print. TV is kind of another notch. So it's even got to be shorter sentences, and you've got to have some bloody pictures, which is really difficult with the gender story because there are none. It's ugly building built in the 1970s or whenever it was built, of the Tavistock. We call them guilty building pictures, but there's only so many you can have. So, and with TV also, there's only so much you can take in, but similarly, it's very fleeting. So I think it's a different skill, but it's also, you've got to be clearer, more concise, less, you can't have jargon. And there are only a certain amount of concepts that you can possibly get into either a television piece or a radio piece. But I never forget an old colleague of mine who worked in current affairs television. Well, I was in current affairs radio at the time. And he said, look, because it was always the case that my department at the time, which made all these Radio 4 documentaries and World Service documentaries and things like that, we would often do a topic and we'd do it really well. And then 6 months later, Panorama would do it, and it would be everywhere. It would be across the BBC, it would be across the newspapers. And they'd have said less than we said. And he said, no, you've got to understand, it's boxing. Current affairs radio is featherweight. You've got all the skill. It's beautiful. It's a joy to watch. And that's the art. He said, TV is the heavyweight. Boom, bash, you make all the impact. It's crude, it's dirty, but everyone remembers it. And I think that's what it's like. So TV makes all the impact compared to radio, but broadcast versus print, it's just very different.
In terms of that impact piece, there's been a lot of discussion now about what's happened with Newsnight. And I was reading a piece last week which was kind of suggesting this was part of a kind of broader dialing down of where TV news and current affairs sits in the ecosystem, as it were, because of the internet and stuff like that. And this was a kind of quite wistful piece by a producer talking about, there used to be lots of money in travel and all of that, and that has faded. But as someone who has worked there and no longer is, what's your view both on Newsnight and on the wider trend?
Well, I wish that the current Newsnight team nothing but success, and they had a really good election. And, not but, I am really quite heartbroken about what's happened to the programme that was. I think if you look back at Newsnight, it has broken some of the most important stories of the last couple of decades, if not more. And it's a quite a unique place to work, because obviously no workplace is all good, but it is like a family, and so many people that have worked on that programme over the years, and so many have left the BBC recently at various leaving dues. There is you look around the room and you think, wow, I've been so lucky to work with some of these people. But there is a real sense of sadness about what's gone, and they'll never get that back. And I think the same, seeing the decision to stop Hard Talk as well, I think there's a real danger that there's no outlet for a more nuanced, developed line of thinking. And it's all very well, bringing everything under the umbrella of what they call news gathering. But the problem with that is you lose diversity of thought. So one of the rationales behind the restructuring of the last few years is to sort of stop replication of the same content and to not waste money and to not have different programs competing for the same contributors and what have you. But the joy of that was that you could take a really big story, and that Newsnight, for example, could have a very different take on it to The World at One, for example. And I think that just reflects the world we live in, because loads of these stories, they don't have one narrative that is the answer. And I think it's quite dangerous, actually, to have lost that. And I think, it goes back to what I said earlier, that I think that is the BBC's role, to be the vehicle for difficult ideas or different ways of thinking. And I do fear that has been lost to a large extent. And, these difficult journalism is expensive and difficult to do. And it's legally tricky, and there aren't very many places that can afford to do it. So that's what worries me.
Did that changed landscape contribute to your own decision to leave in early 2024?
In part. I left in the autumn of 2023 for lots of reasons, though. I have 2 young children, and I was very lucky at Newsnight that I was afforded a lot of flexibility, but it's not the greatest time of day to work on a programme if you've got a young family. That was one reason. Another was that doing the book, I really enjoyed writing my own stuff, and although I'd reported and produced over my time there, I just liked the ownership of it. I liked the ownership of something that was mine. But there was, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't frustration that fueled part of my reason to leave as well. And I felt that the stories that I did, I don't restrict this to gender at all, tended to be quite difficult. They weren't easy to sum up in one line. But since when didn't we do complicated? And it seemed in the last year in particular that the response to most things was, it's a bit complicated, like in terms of kind of getting the story out to other outlets. And I found that quite disillusioning. And of course, the BBC, like any other media outlet, has to keep its audiences up, and you need that younger audience to replenish older ones, but you shouldn't alienate your loyal audience that you have in the first place. And B, I think some of the content aimed at younger audiences just isn't very good. I mean, you can go clickbaity, but the BBC doesn't do that very well. So I don't really think that's serving it. And it's also really insulting to young people to think that all they want is that, you know, only they can deal with 30-second clips on TikTok, and all they want is celebrity, because I just don't think that's true. So it was a variety of reasons. And yeah, I did feel really let down about the gender stuff. As I say, massively supported by Newsnight, but it's quite something that in the kind of the fortnight after the book was published, you know, it was everywhere. It was in every single national newspaper. I had journalists who, I guess they're competitors, but, you know, journalists from all other outlets contact me, and really not very many, and certainly not in the senior management of the BBC.
And how did the role at the New Statesman come about? And then what defines your beat there as an associate editor? Do you have a fairly free rein, or are there particular areas or avenues that you're focusing on?
I do have a very free rein, and I'm very lucky. I guess my beat is the difficult box. So I like to do stuff that is quite, I'm not saying that other people can't do it, but that you might get some pushback from, but these are things that we should be discussing. And that actually, there's not necessarily an easy answer to these things, but I think if you pretend they're easy, or you just won't talk about them because it might upset people, I don't think that's very healthy for democracy or society. So I tend to go for those things, I think. As I've got older and probably a bit leirier, I just don't really mind. Sort of, you care less what people think about you. I mean, obviously it's not nice if people don't like you, but I kind of think the Tavistock story has taught me that sometimes you can be in a minority at seeing something that is really not right. And you're right. So, and we are given, I do feel it's an absolute privilege to do this job, and a real honour to be given a national platform, whether that's on television, radio, or now in print. And I don't take that responsibility lightly. And I think that if there are things that are wrong or need examining, then we have the power to do that. And we're really lucky. And I've, you know, been very fortunate in my education and what have you, and the opportunities I've had in my career to be able to do that. And others are not so fortunate. And so to be able to tell their stories because I've been given this platform, I think that's really important. But my beat, I mean, I do a lot of health stuff, but that's not, my beat is trying to kind of like the most, you know, what's shaping society at the moment? What do we need to be talking about in the broader sense?
You sent over one story which both was health and both was a difficult subject, your piece about traumatic birth. And it starts with the fact that you yourself experienced a really difficult birth with your first child. What was the experience of writing that like, both in terms of revisiting obviously a very difficult part of your life, but also using yourself as a way into a much broader story?
It was very difficult because I've never done that before, and I actually hate, as a principle, that kind of journalism. I don't think journalists should be the story. And for that reason, you know, I tried to keep, you know, when I was interviewed about the book, I tried to keep my private life sort of quite separate. So it was very, very difficult, and very uncomfortable for me because I'd never done it before. It was actually strangely cathartic, though, writing it down. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's 8 years ago now, but it's not something that's ever going to go away. And I think being allowed to sort of write about it and sort of put some of the anger in, But again, it goes back to sort of having this privileged position, because I never actually intended to do that for that piece. I wanted to write a piece on traumatic birth. I have done for many years, and the all-party parliamentary group on birth trauma were doing this inquiry, and I thought, well, that's my way in. And it was only really as I sat in like week after week in the various evidence sessions they had, listening to other women sharing their experiences, like sitting there, trying not to cry and just shaking my head, going, God, this is exactly the same. And this resonates with me. And it was only really through that process that I just felt it was in a way dishonest not to say that it had happened to me. And it felt really weird. It felt wrong not to say that. And I thought in a way it was cowardly not to write it. And the response to that article was extraordinary. I mean, friends, parents of friends, acquaintances, strangers, so many women got in touch. And it was, it was extraordinary response, just to say, this has happened to me. Thank you for writing. I've never been able to talk about it. Some had never spoken about it with their closest family and felt that they could now. And yeah, it was I don't plan to do a lot of that kind of journalism, but it just felt the right thing to do, really.
It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it's interacted with people's writing lives. So be as open or as guarded as you're comfortable with. But in these kind of different spheres you've moved in, so broadcast, print and book writing, how is the kind of financial picture compared in those different areas, and how have you made it work?
I wasn't expecting that. Well, I don't think my book did very well, like compared to lots of books. But I don't think you can make a living out of writing books unless you're, Richard Osman or J.K. Rowling. In that it was less than my salary at the BBC for sure. I wouldn't have been able to give up work to write that book. And I wrote it on maternity leave in a very difficult situation. But to be honest, I don't quite know how people do it, because the advances, if you're, a nobody, are small, and it's a huge amount of time. So financially, yeah, books, no. I get paid more now than I did at the BBC, but I think that's just a reflection of, the trajectory of my career. I think what is sad is that I think in I would say across the media is that it seems, certainly at the BBC, I found that there were different tranches. So depending when you joined, obviously, like the terms and conditions get worse. So every kind of decade or so, every 8 years. So, for example, when I joined in 2008, I never had the final salary pension, but loads of my colleagues did who are older. But I did have a defined benefits pension, which changed, but I still kept a defined benefits pension. My younger colleagues didn't. That was in terms of pay. There were periods where there was a complete pay freeze, whereas prior to the kind of early 2000s, there were quite good pay rises, and and there were different benefits. And I think junior producers or producers, not entry level, but journalists in the first few years of their career, whatever the format, are probably, they're paid pretty poorly, particularly if you have to live in London as well. It's very difficult. I mean, barely the living wage.
Yeah, I think it's very, very difficult for young people today to make a living.
Yeah, it is.
We're coming towards the end of our time. So as a final question for me, I wondered if there were any subjects or topics or investigations that you thought in the future you might like to take on, either as a book or in a different format.
I really want to do more on maternity care. I think it is a scandal at how bad things have become, and there really is no sign that they're improving. I think it's a pretty damning indictment that half of the maternity units in England are not good. I mean, that's pretty bad. And I really want to trace kind of how we got to where we are and what's happened along the way. I'm really interested in exploring more about censorship. Seems like a very strong word, but I think there's a growing, albeit quite small at the moment, but there is a growing concern that I have about, in the realms of science publishing, so not books, but kind of publishing research. I think there's a growing nervousness in certain fields to publish findings that are true, but might offend people. And I think that's really quite worrying. So I'm keen to look into that more. But who knows what the next big thing might be. The world's a complicated place at the moment, so there's plenty to look at.
As a final thing from me, do you think that the kind of rancorous atmosphere, not just about gender, but more broadly in the culture, with a attempt to shut down debate or the idea of cancellation, it's been suggested in some quarters that there has been a bit of a sea change. That people there's a retreat from that. Do you think that's the case, or is it just continuing in a different form?
I oscillate on this one quite frequently. I think there has been a shift for sure, but the toxicity is still there. I mean, here's a very small example. I, like many people, decided to open a Blue Sky account. I tweeted something completely. This is it. So my colleague Rachel Cunliffe at the New Statesman had interviewed the mathematician Marcus de Sautoy, who is fascinating. And I retweeted her interview with him because I'd met him at a book festival earlier in the year, and he's lovely, and I had dinner with him. I get a reply, "Fuck off, Hannah. Twitter's where the hate is. You can go there." Now, I'm assuming that's because someone doesn't like what I've written about the care provided to gender questioning young people. But you're like, seriously? So I still think I do think that there is a lot of division out there, and I think we saw that a bit in the assisted dying debate in the UK. I was really concerned that some media outlets tried to paint it as a kind of culture war issue, where it was like it's kind to vote in favour of assisted dying and conservative and lacking, not progressive, to vote against. And that was just so nonsense, and clearly untrue as well when you look at which politicians voted which ways. It completely defied left and right, and actually all the research that's been done on the public as well, it does not split down any kind of standard political line. So that I think that's really lazy, and I do worry that certain things are being now described as right wing or conservative, and others as left. Free speech, for example, it's not a right wing issue. I mean, that's really troubling. Like, if the left can't reclaim that's really, really disturbing. So, rambling answer to your question, I think things have improved, but I think there's still a long way to go. I think there's a fair bit of toxicity out there and intolerance. And I do worry, particularly in younger people, not to write off the whole of a generation, but it's one of the things that I didn't like so much at the BBC, and one of the things that I felt maybe it was time to go, is that there wasn't, in my mind, the same commitment to impartiality amongst some of the younger members of staff that I had. And that you don't have to agree with something or someone to respect that they hold their views that are different to yours, and that it doesn't make them evil. You can disagree with someone and still be friends with them. And I think that kind of, just what I would call common sense, is kind of being lost. And that's quite sad and worrying.
I'm not sure if that's the note we want to end on, but anyway, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you so much, Hannah, for speaking with us today, and good luck with all your work at the New Statesman and everything going forward.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Hannah Barnes. She's on Twitter at HannahSB, and Time to Think is published by Swift Press. Hello, it's us again, But before we get started with the rest of the outro, we have a Patreon to thank. Simon, take it away.
Yeah, we're super grateful to all the people who've signed up since we've had this new reward option with the much bigger package of pitches. And today we'd like to thank Fauzia Musa. So Fauzia has a debut novel coming out in spring 2026 with an imprint at HarperCollins. And she's also starting a Substack soon for more non-fiction orientated writing. And all the while she is pitching essays and op-eds. She says, absolutely love your podcast and think it's really generous and amazing you share successful pitches for those of us looking to broaden our writing portfolios. Thank you infinitely. Well, thank you, Fauzia. We super appreciate your support and wishing you all the best with the novel and all your other ventures. Anyway, Rachel, returning to the interview, what was your takeaway on the discussion with Hannah?
It's always really interesting to hear about books that have sort of forced their way into the world. And Time to Think obviously falls into that category and has had a significant impact. And it was interesting hearing about the specificities of that and the difficulties around that discussion, but also around the kind of more general writing problems of editing a manuscript down to size and making sure it's in the shape you want. And outside of that, I would just say that the birth trauma piece that Hannah wrote for the New Statesman is excellent and disturbing and well worth a read. If anyone is interested in that topic. How about you, Simon?
I thought it was very interesting. And I thought, it was kind of particularly a publishing story, really. I mean, obviously I have my own priors when it comes to books, having had difficult births with my book on the army. But I thought just super interesting, this idea that she was pitching this idea around that it wasn't getting traction with major publishers, but at the same time, she was getting these kind of missives saying, we love the idea, but we think we can't do it. And that again, similar to my experience, it was an independent press that stepped in and saw it through. And I think, there is a much broader point here, I think, which has come up in many of our episodes in different contexts. Came up a bit with Claire Alexander recently about, is there excessive censorship or self-censorship within British publishing or a kind of groupthink lockstep thing going on? So I thought, really interesting in that sense. And again, I suppose the other technical thing is someone making the move from broadcast to writing. So very, very interesting there. So a great addition to our canon. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what are you consuming?
I have been lazing around for 2 weeks. I've been on holiday and I've done lots of reading. I read Among the Thugs, which you very kindly bought me a copy of, which I've very much enjoyed.
How did you find it?
I really enjoyed it. By the end, I did feel slightly nauseous after all the descriptions of violence, which I think is a sign of good writing. But the bit with the eye.
Because it starts off being like, oh my God, yeah. It starts off being very funny and then you're like, this is just slightly horrific, like the way it gets into.
Yes. And it mirrors his journey, right? As the writer, he says he just can't face it anymore. But it's interesting as someone who...
Well, Rachel, I feel, Rachel, it was a window into your childhood,
Well,
so
it's interesting as well because I like to joke that I learned to swear in the family stand of Old Trafford. But I think even by then, the atmosphere was very different.
I mean, that was all like all-seater stadiums and everything.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, I was kind of joking. Like, it's definitely, there was this huge switch, right?
There was, but it was funny because I was talking to my parents about it. My dad said he's been caught up between, fighting fans before. And he said he took my brother to a match when he was really small. And it was very clear that the fans of the two teams were amassing for a fight, and my dad just had to put my brother over his shoulder and just run because he didn't want to get caught in the middle of it. So anyway, we haven't really explained, but it's Among the Thugs is about football hooliganism. So anyway, I read that and enjoyed it, if enjoyed is the right word. And
by Bill Burford, we should say,
yes,
for anyone who might want to read it.
And I also read Wolf Hall, and my contrarian opinion was that I couldn't really get into... Well, I finished it, but I didn't... It took me quite a long time.
That is a contrarian opinion.
Yeah, and I thought it was going to be right in my wheelhouse because I find that period of history very interesting. So... Yes. Anyway, what about you, Simon?
I have been... Well, I still am in France. I have been here for a week for a magazine assignment, writing a piece about a French alpinist called Benjamin Vedrine, who kind of shot to prominence last year when he set the speed record on K2, the world's second highest mountain, a mountain much harder than Everest, which he essentially ran up in 10 hours and then flew a paraglider off the top. So I was out in the mountains with him, which has been fun. And then talking to his kind of entourage and people like that. And then that's more or less wrapped up. And I've got got a week's holiday. I have been reading a book called Our Kindred Creatures, which is about the kind of growth of the animal rights movement in America connected to an idea that I'm developing, and listening to a bunch of German podcasts, mostly for a couple of magazine assignments that I'm doing over there. So it's sort of mixed cultural intake. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.